I think we should start. We move on to the last presentation of Before Lunch, which is going to be given by Jeff Kipnis, who I guess has been introducing himself for a while. Leaving aside his previous kind of history, Jeff came here when Alan Balfour became chairman to start the new graduate design, and I think it's been somewhat neglected that the beginning of graduate design wasn't actually the DRL, but it was Jeff before, and he arrived. Already the registry were particularly worried. And I remember sitting next to, how can I put this discreetly, the wife of a very famous elderly architectural historian, whose wife, you'll recognize her by my impersonation, said, "Oh my God, that ghastly Alan Balfour, you know what he's done now, don't you?" So I said no, since I was only just joining the place full time. She said, he's appointed Jeff Kipnis. So I waited with some kind of mounting anxiety to meet him. And within an hour or so of meeting him in Charlotte Street with Alan, in that way that you don't understand, you realized this person is my friend for life. And so it's been proved over the years, and I'm always incredibly pleased to welcome him back. I know him to be a great teacher of architecture, despite his manifest efforts to kind of deny it, or but many people who've seen him in crits or have heard his courses or lectures know perfectly well that a high architectural intelligence is always deployed by Jeff, and I've learned a very great deal from him. So I'd like to thank him for coming this conference and ask you to welcome Jeff Kipnis.
Thanks for inviting me, Mark. I'm indebted to Mark because he and Parveen are perhaps my closest friends, or are my Beverly and my closest friends. I think I was invited here as dessert. I'm not sure. But perhaps we're having dessert early. I'm not quite sure. Or maybe isn't there a tradition here where you eat salad after your dessert or something? So there'll be some other thing. But because I'm famously indifferent to the problems of hard history. However, like all parasites, I benefit from it and rely on it entirely. And so I admire it. I just don't like to read it, do it, or know it. So I wanted to, however, the question was, how do we teach history? Just before I get started, are any of you undergraduates? Raise your hand if you're an undergraduate. 1, 2. I rest my case. Basically, because one of the problems here is how do we teach history? And I want to address the question, but I also am a hard pedagogue. I believe in adults and children, even if I don't behave like I believe that. I believe a good way to teach children is through brute force and rote repetition. So I believe, for example, that scales and arpeggios are good, that repeating your multiplication tables are over and over and over again until you really want to cut your throat is a good thing. I can go through this room and ask each of you a simple question, and I can tell you the last multiplication table you learned because you won't know the next one. So if you know 15 by 15, and then I ask you what's 16 times 16, and you don't know, I will know that in 5th grade, that's what your teacher forced you to do, and then invited you to do a little bit more, and then you didn't do it. So it's quite, so my idea really is, I want to approach the question is from a graduate school education. How do we approach history from a graduate school education? Before I do, I thought I'm going to give you all a little test, just for the fun of it. So, I mean, this is school. It is about teaching. I'm going to give you all a little test. You can take it in your mind. It's only, here it is. Let's see. Oh, end show. Don't want to end show. I don't know, raise your hand if you want me to end show. Start over. You would think I would be better at this. I so miss slides. I know how to do it. Sit back down. I miss slides because it took me 3 years to master how you put them in the carousel so they weren't backwards. And having done that and learned my lesson, oh, here's that guy again. He is incredibly capable of sitting still. It's like one of those guys in Venice. Okay, so how many, do you recognize this building? Question one. Raise your hand if you recognize this building. Don't answer, just raise your hand. Okay, I knew Brian would. Okay, second question is, here's the plan of the National Gallery. There's Venturi's edition. Identify its most salient and important architectural issue. Okay? Just kind of briefly think to yourself, what do you think of this building? And then kind of briefly think to yourself, what do you think of this work of art? If it'll help you, I'll give you a hint. The name of the work of art is two pieces of paper identically crumpled. So the question is not only what do you think of it, but how do you do it? Okay, so that said, I wanted to thank the earlier talk, Mark's talk, because there's going to be an uncanny, I think, resonance between the two, basically on the acuity of vision and the significance of writing as distinct from truth-telling. And also, all day yesterday was fantastic. I missed one of the lectures, but I thought I'm a deep admirer of Reinhold for two reasons: his conviction on the truth. I mean, I don't share it. I don't share the same intellectual position he does, but I admire it and I benefit from it. But more particularly, his almost single-handed recuperation of the postmodern as something valuable to look at and think about, and not to see in parochial terms of its bad first, or what you might think of as its bad first iteration in architecture. I think it's an incredibly important discourse, and I really admire the fact that he did take it up. It seemed to me for a little while. It's now become everybody's topic, but so. Brian's wonderful, absolutely wonderful elegy yesterday, and so. Anyway, just the answer to the first question, in case you know, this is this building. The reason I think it's kind of funny that, how many of you got that right? One person, two people? Brian, of course, got it right. So learning to see is a worthwhile thing to do. And the reason I put that test question on there is because my first experience at the AA went like something like this. I came here, I gave a lecture, Mickey called me a cab, the cab pulled up, I got in the cab, he said, oh, how are you, what do you do, who are you? And I said, I'm a professor of architecture. And as my wife and I were driving away, we passed this building, and I said, well, that's an interesting building, what is that? And he said, Buckingham Palace. And then there was this incredible silence in the car as this professor of architecture who unable to recognize. So one thing is good to learn some history is just so you don't look like a fucking idiot. I mean, sometimes it's good to know shit. Later on, I hope it's fun to know shit. But then the second question about this is what are the conspicuous idiosyncrasies? What's the salient feature of Bedford Square? What are its salient features? Does anybody have an answer for that? Brian? It's these four temple front buildings. One on each, and what's odd about them is that 2 are 6 bays, one is 5 bay, and one is 4 bay. And if you look a little bit closer, the corner balustrades, the balustrades that in the corner are not on any of the corners. So the place is actually as wacky as you can be. I mean, it's dizzyingly funny. You can break out laughing walking around Bedford Square and looking at the architecture if you just don't think of it as god-awful old stuff, but as pretty good new stuff that's funny as shit. And then, so I recommend you do it. So. Here's the odd, this is odd, of course, that seems like it's the center because that's us, but the center's over there. This is the 5 bay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is exactly opposite. The 2 6 bays are on each side. They don't line up, and the balustrades don't define their condition. It's really incredible. There's also unbelievable assaults on this. Go look at the number 1. Go look at number 1 Bedford Square. So I like history, and I like history because of the tricks you can do with it. And the tricks you can do with it go something like this. This is my little quote of mine. You can do this kind of trick. And then you can do this kind of trick. It's important if you're going to do tricks that one of them be true. And so that's why I need people like Reinhold. But for me, that kind of play, that kind of misbehavior is really the purpose of my life. I have misbehaved my whole life. In order to discipline that and make a living, I decided to figure out how I could theorize misbehavior in a field. I originally intended to do painting. There were too many people in it, so I decided to do architecture. Architecture seemed particularly interesting to me because it was the field of all fields that really had no discourse of misbehavior. In fact, it was the discourse of proper behavior, and in many ways continues to be that. So then I started teaching architecture, and then let's see what the next slide is. Yeah, so I started teaching architecture, and then I got really depressed because I started to know something. I don't think I'm a very good teacher. Actually, I think I'm a pretty bad teacher. I think I'm a pretty entertaining teacher, but I don't think I'm a good teacher. And the reason I noticed that is that I would get talented students in studio or in seminar, and they would do really well. And I would get poorer students, and I was unable to elevate the quality of their work. And I thought, maybe architecture is just not something you can teach. Maybe it's talent-based, or maybe it's not a pedagogically driven work. And so when I came to the AA at Alan's invitation, I really came here to see if there was such a thing as how to teach architecture in which you could actually raise the level of a student palpably. It turns out I didn't do a very good job, but people like Patrick and the DRL have proved that it can be done, and it's really fantastic. But in order to do that, I started to study the pedagogical histories of other disciplines. Some disciplines have strong pedagogies, like not mathematics. Chemistry has a very strong pedagogy. Physics doesn't have a very strong pedagogy in the sense that you can find great chemists to come out of university settings that didn't necessarily study with other great chemists, but you can find virtually no great physicists that did not study with other great physicists, nor can you find any great mathematicians that did not study with other great mathematicians. Music has a fantastic pedagogy, but it's a pedagogy that's between the two. Painting has no pedagogy whatsoever. There's virtually no relationship between the quality of a painter and this talent and the education that they've had. So I started to look at those questions about how did one teach. Later on, or currently, because my interest is in new building, that's my only interest. I'm not particularly interested in interpretations of older buildings or not history. I mean, I am a rock and roll theorist and critic. The latest thing in architecture is when I'm interested, I talk about it, I write about it. About 6 weeks later, it's gone. No one really pays any attention to what I said. In retrospect, I'm almost always wrong about what I said about it. But I wanted to speak a little bit yesterday. Yesterday we heard really wonderful discussions of two kinds of the efficacy through demonstration. And those are the discourse of power, truth, and authority. And there's a big difference between power and authority, and we did seem to align them yesterday. Authority is essentially the ability to force someone to bend their will. You can coerce that. Power is actually the capacity to make someone act on at your behest through their will. So, and truth is one of the most interesting, charisma is one of those, truth is one of those. For example, if you're forced to stop at a red light in the middle of the night, you feel that as onerous authority. If I ask you, on the other hand, what 2 plus 2 is, and you say 4, you're delighted. So in that case, mathematics is far more powerful than the apparent onerous authority of the red light. So I don't believe, on the other hand, that architecture, that new building in particular, and architectural effects work through demonstration. I believe they work through trickery, subterfuge, and seduction. Much like the art, I think all the arts are they're sort of magic-based. Actually, Trickery also argued this thing. And they're much more like powers, like magical powers. And a good example for me is when I go to a film, I have virtually no interest in the direction whatsoever. I'm slightly interested in the acting, but I'm particularly interested in the soundtrack and the production design, because those are the things that are controlling the film and its reception at the level of subterfuge. Yeah, if you listen to the shower scene of Psycho without the soundtrack, you don't really care that much. If you listen to the soundtrack without the shower scene, you're pretty scared anyway. I'll sing it for you. You know. So for me, that's the way I see the work of architecture, and so that means I decided to go back and re-examine the pedagogical history, because I think basically writing theory is just another word for writing pedagogy. When you write a theory, you're basically telling someone, or you're proposing a way to teach someone to do something or do something differently. And actually, if you pay good attention to good pedagogy, you're not going to like this, but a good pedagogue is someone who takes the work of genius, breaks it down into exercise so that it can disseminate as mediocrity. So the job of a great teacher is essentially to produce a lot of mediocre students by analyzing ineffable works of genius, turning them into exercises, distributing the exercises in the conviction that eventually out of that will grow new genius. When Tchaikovsky wrote the B-flat minor piano concerto, it was considered an irrelevant piece of music as only 2 people could play it. You cannot graduate from a third-rate conservatory today without being able to play it, because slowly but surely it was been turned into little performance exercises, and anybody can play it. Even I can play it, although it takes me 3 or 4 days to get through it. Thank you. He actually knows the piece of So, then it says A-bomb example. Another, and this has a little bit to do with the truth. Right after the August bombing of Hiroshima, in September of Hiroshima, the American forces created a joint task force with Japanese forces to examine to do an epidemiology of the deaths of the populations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm so sorry I forgot to scan this slide, because if I showed you these 2 graphic images, they're penetratingly beautiful. But anyway, the American mathematicians did their study, and the Japanese mathematicians did their preliminary study, and they both came back 6 months later to present in a joint conference. And the Americans had broken the population of Hiroshima into age groups and gender, and distance from the bomb. So it was, ages 0 to 10, male, 10 to 20, 20, 30, et cetera, and female, and then distances from the bomb. And the Japanese mathematicians had broken into categories that went something like firstborn male son living at home, all other children, paternal grandparents, doctors. It was like, so it wasn't just relationships, but it was also social performances in the culture. Also, by the way, distances from the bomb. So the 2 got together and realized that, or claimed, or argued that neither had meaning to the other whatsoever. So in an effort to produce truth, they essentially produced social discourse, I think confirming much of what Reinhold was saying yesterday. And it's a beautiful thing to see. Even how they draw the statistics is incredibly, like bar graphs for the Americans and these very unusual circumferential graphs for the Japanese. I'll send anybody it if you want to see it. So that convinces me that even the discourse of the truth, in the end, is going to be vulnerable to the vicissitudes of trickery, subterfuge, and seduction. Now, thank you. Guess what I'm about to say? I love this painting. This painting caused me to move to New York. I saw it on the walls of the Modern when I was 15 years old. I loved art, but this one I thought I could get, and I was really driven to move there. And I remember this painting for a long time. I know I told this story at Columbia, but And so I actually had went to New York to write painting criticism, which was my first love. Turned out, like I said, there were a lot of good painting critics. Nobody was writing contemporary architecture criticism, so I could immediately be the best in the world by being, and it worked. And I continue, now there's two of us, and I'm either number one or number two on every ranking. So I thought, so you want to study this, you try to figure out, what do I think about this painting? Do you like this painting? Yes, I like this painting. But when you look at this show at the Sonnabend Gallery, there were 17 paintings in the show. 2 were bought by the Museum of Modern Art, 11 were bought by other institutions, and the rest remained unsold until they finally went into private hands. And so I got really interested about how the decisions by curators were made. Like, why did Elderfield buy this for MoMA and reject the other paintings? What was better about this painting than the other painting? So later on, I started to look at this more. Something about, 4 years ago, right after Lichtenstein died, I discovered this painting. It was painted in the last year of his life. It's not about the last year of his life, but I thought, wow, that is a wild painting. I knew a lot about his work, and I thought, this is an uncanny and unexpected and unpredictable painting by Roy Lichtenstein. And the reason for that is for almost the entire, up to this painting, in over 40 years, he never changed style, but he changed subject matter. So first he did pop work, then he did neoclassical paintings, then he did, this is a little quotation from Matisse. And so as you understand these paintings more and more, his exploration of the capacity of his artistic thinking he went to Ohio State University, by the way. By the way, not only did he go to Ohio State University, I looked up his master's degree thesis. This is hope for everybody. It is the single stupidest piece of work I have ever seen. He basically copied the styles of 7 early modern painters and wrote a poem to each one. And then he graduated. Astonishingly stupid. Went to New York, met Warhol, met the whole group. He and Warhol were in the first, never met each other. They were in an early show of the post abstract expressionist group. Warhol came in with a painting of Superman and Batman. Lichtenstein came in with one of the comic book pieces. As soon as Warhol said it, he thought, I can't do this. This guy's much better than me. And then that's when he started the soup cans. So. Okay, so I started, I'm thinking about this. So there's all these arguments about, the hard line. Everything has this black hard line, black hard line. So he's delving into history, using it as he desires. But then at the same time, his work is setting into motion painters that are painting at the same time that he knows and that he's living with in New York. So this is David Reed and Jonathan Lasker. And so if you look at this painting, you think, what is it? How do I know? How do I evaluate it? How do I understand it? What is it about? And the only way I thought you could possibly know that is to know all that other field of work. So for me, I think one of the things I loved about that Ryan Holst said yesterday is that there's only history. And I'm willing to accept that if he will include the present as history and the future as history, which I'm sure he does. And so the question is, what is the discussion? And the discussion is always occurring in time and therefore produces a history. And so I had a graduate student just basically go back and put it in the style of the early paintings so I could make all those things hardline, just so I could understand it. And it is, I won't tell you my thoughts on it, but it is profoundly different and I think deeply affectively different in its consequences. And so my question, therefore, is since I'm only interested in new building, and I'm not particularly interested any longer in the interpretation of new building, I am only interested in what architects try to do when they're doing new works of architecture and being part of that discussion, which shifts me from interpretation to effects. So I decided I would go back and re-examine I decided my first version of studying pedagogy was wrong. It occurred to me that there were, in the United States, I'm not sure it's true here, that creative writing programs are utterly different and distinct from literature programs. Sometimes they're embedded in the same departments, but they're taught differently, their curricula are different. Almost all creative writing programs are either pre-undergraduate or graduate. So get them to write. And so I thought, well, this is what I need to do. I need to study a creative writing curriculum to see how I was going to incorporate the teaching of history into architecture. And really, it boiled down to one thing. basically you start to write, and then through the writing, and you meet with the other colleagues. It's very studio-like. You start to write because the generosity of the arts is profound and its most admirable characteristic. You don't need the right or a license to paint. You don't need a right or a license or permission to design a building or any other work of art. It is utterly indifferent to your expertise. It's only the effects you produce that matter. And great works of architecture have been done by naive, we all know this, great works of writing, great works of architecture. So you cannot make an argument about professionalism as in the same way you can in the sciences or in law, for example. Although self-conscious teaching has actually accelerated the production of quite a genre and accomplishment in the field. I'm not against it, but you can't make the argument that without a certain body of knowledge you can't begin. You can begin, and so all these creative writing programs basically start you off, and then the teacher leads you to your accidental recapitulation of historical work, and then you get interested in history that way. So it's not about teaching history about backwards. It's about starting with your work and then discovering your own and independent insights that other artists have shared, artists of note, and then that becomes a kind of libidinal momentum is drawn out of that, and you get passionate about it and you learn it, and your work grows from it. So that's become my model at Ohio State and the places that I'm right now redoing their pedagogy. Before that, though, the question of history had occurred to me, and I had two models of it before I started to do my work in post-structuralism. One was the stare decisis model, do you know that, stare decisis? It's a legal term which essentially means it's the argument of precedent, that a court doesn't overturn a decision unless it has compelling reasons to do that. In the United States, it's informal. It's just an informal, it's not formal. In England, interestingly, it was formalized in 1898. Is that right? Basically the House of Lords, which until I think the Supreme Court was formed here, was not entitled to overturn one of its own decisions. I think in 1966 there was something called, I wrote it down here, something called the Practice Act, which enabled them not to obey precedent, but it's only been used a couple of times. So stare decisis and the term precedent occupies our thinking about architectural history in the way that I think offends students. Basically, it means I can't change something without good reason. And I think that was like the worst idea. It is an unbelievably boring thing. And so what you hear in studios is this glossolalia of false good reasons for changing things. Oh, well, I lined it up with the sun, and then a bat came across it, and then I wanted to respond contextually to the fact that there was a bat around. Or I took the word library, I Xeroxed it up, I extruded it to the prevailing code, and now it's a great library. That was as opposed to, I don't know why the fuck I did this, you tell me. And then you show him basically 20 other works of architecture, where great works of architecture by Korb and whoever, and you say, look, he didn't know why the fuck he did it either, but now we kind of know why the fuck he did it. So, I also knew the Wolfflinian model, which I thought was the more profound model, and that was the relationship between a painting and another painting is more interesting than the relationship between a painting and its subject matter. And that seemed quite simple to me. It also was much more permissive because it was just about a conversation. And it let me do stuff like get rid of science everywhere except at the DRL. And somebody would come to me and say, I'm going to study, I want to do a library, and then they say, I'm going to go study all about libraries. I'm going to say, why don't you go study all about buildings? And they'd say, well, I need to know the program, I need to know it better. I said, well, if you want to paint a good painting of an apple, should you eat an apple? Or should you look at another painting of an apple? Or should you find out the biophysics of an apple? And generally you could convince somebody that the best way to do that is go copy another painting, and even if you try to copy it perfectly, your existential difference will manifest itself in the work, and with a little bit of intentionality, you get tremendous freedom and tremendous liberty. So I love that. Then I came upon the Derridian. I came upon it through Derrida. It's actually a much older argument I discovered, and let's call it a general post-structuralist formulation. It goes something like this. that the copy produces the original as the original. Now, this was an important formulation to me, and I think its morality and ethics is important in the following. Basically, I will ask pink shirt. What's your name? Aldo? Wow. Tough to live down. Never mind. Which came first, you or your father? Sorry? Which came first? I'm sorry too, but yeah, you or your father? That is such an AA answer. Okay, which came first, you and your mother? Okay. If you ask your mother, are you my mother? And she says yes, in her heart, is she telling you the truth? No. Believe me, there's no such thing as a mother or a father. You came first. You produced the father as the father. And the secret is, they never are it. You know? I realized when I was my dad's age at 25 years old, and I thought to myself how irresponsible, incompetent, and stupid I was. That poor guy who had to kind of walk around and pretend like he knew what to do. And how relieved he was when I got the fuck out of the house. So this idea that the copy produces the original as the original started to really occupy my thinking. But the thing that's really important here is that the copy doesn't take the place of the original or gain ascendancy. In its power to produce the original as the original, it produces it with all the full authority of its originality. You know, and so in that sense, you cannot, it's not an excuse for the preference of today versus yesterday. It's about a constant todayness that's being mobilized by the productions of new work. You know, when Marx says, you know, the relationship between history repeats itself first as tragedy, then as farce, I don't know about the English translation, maybe farce is wrong in some way, but farce seems to me used there instead of comedy as an effort to maintain the authority of the tragedy, because farces I think of farce as pejorative, as opposed to the qualities that might be maintained between tragedy and comedy. So but on the other hand, I understand that the point being that whenever you see, it's a little bit like how you make a horror movie. And how do you make a new horror movie? Which is the question, the pedagogical question. How do you make a good new horror movie? How do you make a horror movie that's scary today? Here's the two things you have to do. You have to know how all the other people made horror movies that were scary before you. And the one thing you can guaranteed won't work is to do that. So, but if you don't do that, if you don't know that, you're less likely. Like I said, the promiscuities of the arts allows for the possibility that somebody could just make something flat out scary out of nowhere, but you're less likely to be able to have the technique to produce the effect of horror. So more and more I become interested in effects, and less I'm interested in interpretations. For example, I'm really interested in why the crab scene in the first King Kong is unbelievably horrible, whereas the rest of the movie, I mean, it was the one where everybody ran out of the film. You know the one I'm talking about there? He's in a pit with snakes and crabs, and everybody runs out of the theater because it's so horrifying. I also know the interpretation of the 1933 version of King Kong as an allegory of American racism. You know, a black thing is dragged from Africa against its will, put on the stage in, I mean, you know. So those kinds of interpretations are easy to do. You can fuck up any good work, you can fuck up any good movie with it. Do you know, have I ruined Forrest Gump for you, any of you? Have I ruined Forrest Gump for you? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. I can do that for anything. A good interpreter can make or ruin anything. I got interested in how do I work on the techniques to produce effects. And so the whole issue of the pedagogy of history for me is completely governed by that problem. Let's see where I am. Okay. Also, here's what I face. Because I'm a rock and roll critic, I get shit like this. What do you think of this, Jeff? They say. And I say, well, give me a minute. Then so this is Francois Roche of RNC, and it's actually a brilliant building. Then I get this, a gigantic turd in the middle of Andorra, you know, and I'm supposed to like immediately have something to say about those. So I need shortcuts and I need tricks. And basically, for me, having ways to think about something and recognizing something is not something that authorizes it. It allows me to set it into motion. And at this point, Mark and I started a text about the role of architectural criticism, and we took it as our premise that it's pointless to criticize a building or a project in architecture like you would a movie or a book or a painting. Because basically, that kind of criticism and that kind of judgment has to do with the consumption. And by the time the architecture project is done or the building is built, what can you do? Let's say I build a building or you build a building and I hate it. So should everybody just leave it? Or don't look at it anymore? Or what should we do? Immediately tear it down? Or what? So we had this idea that what a good critic is someone who can perform a work of architecture for an audience, bring it to life for the first time, even if that performance has nothing to do with the architectural intention. Although it will always be, the attention will be available to the performance, and you should always talk to the composer or the architect. Your job is to add something else to it and then bring it to life. And so I hope one day we'll finish that essay. So my job is actually, I'll show you some pictures that'll help this come to life. Now, here's something I think is important. If you're interested in architectural effects, then perhaps you should see what are the effects that are important to the world of, that you would like to imagine you're going to have a conversation with about what they like about building. Now, 5,000 journalistic criticisms of buildings were combed through meticulously by my students in my one and only exercise of archive, and every value judgment was rated. These were based on client articulated values for new building. And these are the top 7. The one in red I simply put there because although the client didn't know it, these are governed by law. It can't fall down, it can't burn up, it has to, so I call those codes. And then the rest in order of importance was cost, comfort, convenience, familiarity, pride, and pleasure. Now, I'm curious, any of you ever take a class in any of that crap? Do you care about that? Cost you're going to learn later. But these are not values that we pursue in our own work. And the reason for that is really simple. They're easy. And here's how you can learn them. This is what we call our hardware store in the United States. I think you call it a DIY or B&G or what is it? Yeah. So you go there and you buy these little books for $9.95 and they tell you how to do this. You can buy the entire collection for about $230. Now, how much are you spending to be here? And they're fantastic. They have ultimate home plan, all kinds of home plans, details of each room, how to build it, how to fix it, even how to make it green. And what's interesting is that there is one of these at every level for every building type. You may not find schools and hospitals here at the hardware store, but you will find building type manuals, airports at RIBA bookstore, at the AII bookstore, a complete guide to how to do it right and make sure you meet these values. So clearly, if I'm interested in architectural effects, I'm not going to be interested in those architectural effects. In fact, I no longer call those architectural effects, I call those building effects. So I'm now responsible to articulate or formulate an idea of architectural effects as distinct from building effects to assure that there's a purpose to the pedagogy. How can you actually have a pedagogy unless what you want to know what to accomplish? Look, by the way, look how great these houses are. Now, I challenge anyone in this room to draw a plan that good. It's a damn good plan. You know a good plan in an American house because the biggest issue is how close you can get the kitchen to the garage. So you carry your bag. That's how you win the best house of the year. In fact, I have a theory that all you have to do is refrigerate the garage. So you pull in, shut the door, and then it's it. You don't even have to take the bag. You might have to move something to the freezer. And so actually, these are seriously interesting plans. You don't have to know any history. These are what we would call a pattern book approach to basic planning for a house that meets those codes. Now, I also think pattern book is something we don't have in our education, and that I actually advocate more for undergraduate education at the level of doing scales and arpeggios or basic mathematics. You don't have to learn the history of adding to learn to add. Then later on, it's interesting to learn the history of adding, and actually there are some interesting moments in the history of adding. I can't remember one right now, but I think 9 and 9 was like a big debate. It was like early on, like in Cavemen. They got up to 8 and 8 and they were okay with it, but when they were trying to add 9 and 9 and 9 or 10, there was no zeros. I think that was the problem. Anyway, so I think these are intelligent works that we should pay attention to, because this is sort of the dentistry. Like yesterday, Brian mentioned dentistry, and I thought, it's so incredible. Like, a good artist should be able to do a good architect should be able to do good dental architecture, which means make it the right size, make it the right shape, make it the right color. Don't spend a lot of money before they're allowed to do anything else. Instead, like, you don't really want a decon tooth, pomo tooth, parametric tooth. You don't want Zaha Hadid field of teeth, which makes a beautiful field of field effects. You don't want a Tony Cragg tooth. So it was a wonderful analogy, and I thought, I guarantee you that when I hire an architect to do my house, it won't be anybody I know. It'll be a dental architect. Aren't these beautiful? By the way, $9.95. These are from the Ultimate Plan book. Instead, I started to think, my interest is in a set of architectural effects that have to do with my interest in misbehavior. I got into architecture at a time when I met first Peter Eisman and then Bernard Tschumi and that group of people. Little did I know that their momentary interest in disciplinary misbehavior was going to be short-lived and wrong. But it was perfect for me. So I took it up, and I'm interested in misbehavior because I'm primarily interested in not so much in democracy, but in freedom. Freedom is an affect caused by the removal of unwarranted or undeserved authority. And since architecture seems to exercise extraordinary authority despite its efforts not to, Bataille's main complaint about architecture is it could only serve power. That when you went into a great cathedral and you were silenced by the beauty and the atmosphere and the reverie of it, you were not silenced in the presence of God, you were made submissive in the presence of the Catholic Church. And I was moved by that, and I thought, and it has a tragic dimension, so I became interested in the discourse of political effects in architecture, not architecture association with politics as politics as representation, but is there such a thing as an effect in architecture which one could think of as being political? And I did some work on it, and basically I've kind of summed it up in these categories. On the top, it's the conceptual. Basically, if a building can stop, make you think about the institution you're in, then you're no longer at the will of its soundtrack. And let's say conceptual work does that. If you go to the Wexner Center and all you see are columns where the art should be and materials everywhere, you're either pissed off about it. You're particularly pissed off if you can't find the front door. You're 50 years old and you got to go to the bathroom. It's a very unpleasant thing to be running around that damn building trying to get in to find a bathroom. But on the other hand, if you're stopped and reflecting, you feel the capacity of the museum to essentially tell you that the art you're about to see is great art subsides, and I think it's really a worthwhile. But the effects don't really particularly have anything to do with the quality of the building as an experience. The second one has to do with staging character. If you go to the Breuer Museum, we discussed this later. Architecture has a very good capacity to put you in the right mood, attitude, and behavior for the institutional character you're in. So you tend to shut up. In fact, if you want to get rid of architecture's ability to make you shut up and behave, you tend to have to turn the lights off, shut the windows, and give everybody a drink, which is what they discovered at casinos and bars. So architecture's capacity to put you in a frame of mind and in a mood that's defined by the institution is very good. It's a great power. But let's say you don't want to do that. Let's say at the Whitney, let's say you want to let somebody come in and be in a different mood.
Jeff,
Yes.
you just defined the societal function of architecture.
Yes, I know.
Described to
I'm completely.
And why do you want to be naughty and rebel against it? That's what it's all about.
300 grand a year and a modicum of fame. I don't know. We're going to see. I agree. But you mean, why would I want to change that? I mean, if you look at the Seattle Library and you look at Breuer's Library in Atlanta, I think it was a great idea that you put somebody in a Frankfurt School attitude at the Breuer Library. I also think the Seattle Library, when you encourage them to imagine themselves as commodity information traders and essentially a public realm. You know, instead of keeping the city out with a bridge, you let the city in and you let the riffraff in. I don't think one is good and one is bad. I think it's liberating to have the options. So anyway, and the last one had to do with new authenticities. I mean, these are not the basis of the lecture, but so, you know, I'm looking at Frank Gehry's, this is the Museum for Andorra, and I have to sort of evaluate, and it's clear that he wants to deal with the building typology of the site and the materiality of the background, but he doesn't want to repeat the history, which would be the worst thing he possibly does. And so he builds this, and, you know, you can just, I mean, you know, clearly this tower is about reflecting the background. It's kind of grotesque. And so, you know, there's a quality to it that becomes easy to describe. So this is an old authenticity. This is like, how does one take an old sense of authenticity and reanimate it? And he uses this stuff called, like puffed aluminum. It's not called puffed. What's it called? I mean, aerated aluminum. It's like puffed rice, except it's puffed aluminum. So the material, you know, the choices of the material, the behavior of the material, interesting. This, Francois Roche, is exactly the same project, but it's actually a little bit more conservative in the sense that it uses real local materials. In this particular case, the dust of Bangkok. And so what he does, and I know you know this building, he builds this museum, he wraps it in this electrostatic foil. The electrostatic foil attracts the dust, and then that becomes the, you know, the contextualism. So it's a détournement of materiality and a surrealistic with a surreal ambition. I think deeply politically and deeply interesting project. Short-lived for sure, but people will be singing it for a long time. I also think the programming here and the attitude about the galleries is equally important, because if you'll notice, it's basically banal. And in fact, you will look at a lot of plans. I believe that if any of you look at the Venturi plan for the National Gallery, you must agree it's utterly banal. And then you have to ask yourself, is he an idiot? And is a banal plan an act of stupidity? Or is there good reasons to do a banal plan in relationship to the National Gallery? Is there good reasons to do a banal plan here? And it will belong to an argument about the need to remove all architectural conceit, period, from certain zones of the building, simply because any architectural seat is an onerous presence. So, let's try this. I asked some of you, where are the undergraduates? You want to try? What do you think of this building? It's bullshit. Bullshit? A lot of people say it's bullshit. You don't like it? You don't like it? You don't like, you know, like Will Alsop? One of the great graduates of this. In fact, this building is all about the AA and its history. You don't like it. What if I say to you that this building actually accomplishes more effect at liberating an audience than any building I've ever seen? It's deeply liberating. You like Artecker?
I would say it's not useful.
Useful. You can go in it. You can go to the bathroom.
Useful, I think you're saying how liberating the audience.
Oh, I don't know. Well, we'll see. So, do you understand its history? What is its history? Name its historical components.
Looking pretty much like several years right now.
Okay, Villa Savoye. Good. Villa Savoye was serious. Let's say tragic. This is farcic. Would you say? You don't like farce. You like tragedy. You're at the wrong school. So I did a little mining. I don't like Will Alsop personally. I love him, but he is one of the world's worst painters, and in my deep regard for painting, the fact that he exists on the face of the earth is assault to one of my true loves. Have you ever seen his painting? And the reason I know this is this is the fourth iteration of this building. He had to keep getting costs down. The first three, all the patterning on the exterior was his painting, which is how it's shown on his website. He didn't even show this. So he's basically disavowed this project. But what happened is as the cost went down and down and down, he couldn't afford to put his painting on there, the building got better and better and better and better. And it's really great Thank God it doesn't have that crap all over it. So, blood spatter, I don't know. So, I'm looking at this painting. So I decided I need to do an archaeology of the resources of this painting. You know, it's got some odd features. Like, it's got these pencil point columns at the top and the bottom. Did you notice that? Does everybody notice that? That's like, I know, Brian, you can't keep shaking your head, yes, because you and I are trained at noticing the most trivial details and expanding them into the most rhapsodic ruminations. And we seem silly. Like, I think those pencil point columns at the top and bottom are, for me, as interesting as the questions Isle raised last night about forensic architecture. Now, I'm embarrassed about that a little bit. I understand that the Palestinian problem, war in the earth, the complete meltdown of the world economy, the fact that we now have 3 billion more people going to be born in your lifetime, that there are not any scarce resources for you anymore, there's no more energy. I think these are, you know, but for me, that's as interesting. And it's a little hard to, I don't know. So that's why I got so mad last night. So I'm looking at these things, and I thought, okay, it's got really bad interior. So like you, I start there. Everybody has to start there. You can't do any architecture unless you start there or the glass house. Would that be fair? I mean, don't you think the walking city is fair? I think it's fair. Would cool houses, the columns at Villa Savoye, they hate each other? They were in school together. Weren't they in school together? I don't know, roughly at the same time. Would that be fair? Le Frenois? Maybe that's not so fair. I mean, I had a hard time figuring out this red thing. I had everything else. I thought, fuck, maybe it's, I could, because in America you can't say fuck and all that stuff. I wanted to say it was an alien coming from outer space and fucking the building. But I couldn't say that. So I thought, oh, I can get this mosquito, and it's landing on the building, and it's sucking the blood out of the building. You know? And so for about 2 years, all my students added, that was the answer on the exam, sucking the blood out of the building. Then I found this fantastic painting in the National Gallery, which is George Slade, the dragon, and it's Moretti, and I thought, okay, well, that's where it came from. And now I now know for a fact that's where it came from. Isn't that right? You don't believe me? You think we need to go ask Will Alsop? Yes? No? Here's the deal. All I care about is, will you ever be able to get it out of your head? Yeah, that's all I care about. When I walk out of here, will you ever be able to tell a story of that red thing or anything I've said about that building with, in any other terms? So as far as I'm concerned, I've done my job. So the real question then is, if that is the farce of this, what is the intellectual, social, political, moral benefit of it? It's obtuse. It is, on the other hand, utterly ephemeral, totally graphic, zero weight. The joke about the floaty, which now have base and capital restored, but base and capital to restored in such a way as to increase the sense of weightlessness and irrelevance of the building. The building has the lightest possible touch I think it could possibly have. It is a comic building. So instead of being tragedy and farce, I believe it is tragedy and comic. And that we begin the problem of the exercise of the comic in architecture with buildings and works like this. Comic being quite different from farce, and also quite different from jokes. It's not about laughing or telling jokes. Few people, American architects try that. Stanley Tyron tried that for a while. Basically, wrote his career, don't do it. Don't tell jokes in architecture, because nobody wants to hear a joke for 30 years. Make them smile, you know, whatever. But everybody kind of smiles at it. But anyway, so for me, this is where the title for this talk came. So, we should, oh yeah. So now we've talked about the irrelevance of the plan, or removing architectural interest from the plan. So what was your answer about what was about this plan? I don't care what Venturi was doing or what you heard he was doing. What's interesting? What's salient? What's architecturally exciting about this plan? I know I'm not supposed to be walking around. I'm going to go back and repeat it.
Architecturally selling about this plan.
Yes. Why is that plan that way? Are you an architecture major? Okay. You can't know the answer. You have to make it up. It's the deal. Because as soon as you make it up, you have a technique. It won't matter if it's right or not, but once you make up an answer, and if it has a sufficient capacity to compel an audience to follow your answer, you now have a technique. So it doesn't matter what the architect tried to do or not. So what's it do? You have to look closely. What are its features? Here's what, let me show you what you're doing. You're doing this. Might as well do this. I mean, if you don't know, just pick this or this. Or here's the deal. Another deal is we don't get to eat lunch until you answer this question. So. No. Well, there's the problem. That's the problem. Is one of the gifts of architectural history is to let you cut through the shit really quickly. It doesn't have to respond so much. I was looking at the Ascent of Mary by Titian in Venice, because I read in a book that it was one of the great paintings in art history. And I went to look at it, and I thought, it looks like everything else. What am I supposed to look at? So you look here, you look there, you're looking at everything. And then this guy, actually wasn't a guy, it was a little girl with a, she said, are you having problems? And I said, no, I got it completely. And then she understood, and she said, yes, I know. Isn't it wonderful how he captures the difference between heavenly light and earthly light? And the minute she said that, I thought, oh my God, I got it. You know, so as Mary goes up, the modulation from earthly light and shadows to heavenly light and ubiquitous presence of God with no, I mean, it's just fantastic. So thank her for that. So, you got one?
But maybe it's so successful because
Well, what do you think it's trying to do? Like politically, what do you imagine? You're an American asshole populist architect. You don't expect to win this competition at all. It was set up to give to Harry Cobb. He blows it. And they build this building. What do you think, what do you imagine they might have been thinking? Look at the original building and look at all the additions. They have strong central ceremonial entries. Okay. Tell you, how do you enter this building? There's two entries, one from the street and one from the third floor. You can see it in the plan. I'm assuming you can still read a plan. We will be the last generation able to do that. So how do you enter? What happens when you enter that building? Do you go to a ceremonial entry? Now look, all right, if you go up the stairs, where do you arrive? Look at the plan. You dead end into a pair of elevators. You go up the stairs, and the first thing you're invited to do is leave. Which is kind of interesting. A dead end. What about the other entry? It is really hilarious. I mean, it's laughingly funny. You come up steps, you're in the world of God, you go to all these wonderful sub-worlds of God, you walk over here, and then you keep walking, and boom! Boom! You bump into a wall. You know, there's no way to stop. It unceremoniously dead ends at an angle to a wall in the midst of a department store hanging. So it's either gloriously interesting as a piece of removing onerous authority contained in this diagram, or it's a work of idiocy. I'm on the side of, depending on the audience, but in this audience, I'm on the side of it's being brilliant. For $200, I can change size. And hence the title, hence this title. So I'm gonna. I've just recently. We're trying to figure out what's next. My job is people are always asking me what's next. My current answer is electrospastic. And then they say, what is that? And I say, well, you know, electrospastic. It's kind of like Talking Heads meets electricity. I'm not sure what it means. So anyway, I decided to do this history of architecture in relationship to power. Spectrum of social orderliness. Here it is. I can't. What the fuck? Put this down. Use this. So here's the history of, here's the political history of the world from the beginning: slavery, serfdom, blind obedience. This was the great period of architecture. Royalty, the church, totalitarian, general oppression. This is when we thrived. Had the most clients, the most prestige. We were super happy. Then there was this obeying and behavior period, which we call modernism. There was civility. We did okay. We weren't great there. And then here's where I enter. This is Peter Eisenman, Bernard Schumi, there's this misbehaving period. And then we don't want to go here. This is like abuse of children, this kind of stuff. So you want to stay out of jail and not hung by mad lynch mobs. You know, so this was my area, but I thought there's this real interesting zone between behaving and misbehaving, which a lot of kids today I think are working on. I call, oh, by the way, this is the happiness of architects: happy, powerful, rich, beloved. You know, so you can see that during the period, the first 4 periods, they were really happy. Then it kind of declined to tenured, comfortable, ignored but respected. Hence the bow tie. So it comes down here. And then there's this little, the theoretical architects, like the ones I mentioned, they kind of peaked here. But I thought if I could figure out what was in this zone, maybe we could get something really good. They're miserable, poor, pitiful, and broke. So this zone seemed like them. And I call that zone the zone of ain't misbehaving, which is where I am right now. So all I want to do when I'm mustering my interest in history is this is the effect I want to produce. I know the effect I want to produce, and I will mine any source: the future, the present, the past, bad, the guy. That's why I love the guy. What's his name? Your guy. Scott. I love the fact that he got it wrong. I love the fact that, did he give a shit if he got it wrong? That's the thing I like most. He told the story he wanted to tell, and then somebody said, you know, you should fix that. And he said, okay, I'll fix that later. This is misbehaving. This is John Chamberlain's work. John Chamberlain was an American abstract expressionist who basically did drip paintings. He said he did them out of metal. There's Pollock. This is Matthew Barney, and this is an interesting production of a historical effect. So this thing looks very much like this thing. But if you ask how this got there, the answer is going to be really simple. There's a film of these cars chasing this car down and beating it up. You ever seen a Matthew Barney film? So in the film, these cars trap this car in a basement. This is an old Plymouth, and essentially tear it apart like a lion. And so you see this in a museum, and you see this in a museum, and you say, oh, I know how this got there. Jackson Pollock melancholically threw paint on it and then went and killed himself. This thing got, so that's how we know the authenticity, we know the labor, we know the angst, we know the tragedy. This got there when I see this in the museum, because I remember these cars chase it down, beat the shit out of it. I forget the fact that cars don't really chase things down and beat the shit out of it. And they don't really care. So I don't care, but there is no presence of the artist as an authenticating tragic figure. Do you like this? Does everybody like this? I love this. 2 pieces of paper identically crumpled. You know how you do this? You know how to do this? How would you identically crumple 2 pieces of paper? I thought Tom Friedman took weeks to do this. That's what I thought. Then I was in an airplane. I had 2 napkins. I swear to God. I had 2 napkins. They're like this. I didn't realize there were 2. I threw them down and then hit like that. I thought, wow. $180,000. Why $180,000? Because of this. This is factum 1 and 2. Robert Rauschenberg's breakthrough in essentially killing the tragic existential presence of the artist as an authenticating figure. He paints 2 identical paintings, or as identical as he can get them. They have graphic devices which are strong in their capacity to produce repetition and seriality. He has block letters. But it also has drips and abstract expressionist gestures, which are, to the best of his ability, duplicated. And so this was a challenge to the idea of the moral authority, of existential presence, and the value of the individuality. This is actually the capacity to commodify the individual and sell it. And what really was interesting about this painting, these 2 paintings, MoMA bought one, and the biggest collector of abstract expressionists other than MoMA in the world, which was LACMA at the time, bought the other one. And for 40 years, they were never shown together because both of them were worried that they were going to undermine the value of their work. About 3 years ago, they now have a contract where they spend 6 months in one, 6 months in the other. But it's the first time you actually can see the work. But this piece is this, it draws on the history of this piece, but in its digression from it, in its clinamen, in its swerve, it becomes even more liberating in the sense that there's no canvas, you don't have to know or feel anything, but if you do, it gets better. So just 2 seconds on my current work in studio, or this is called Why I'm Not Ever at the AA Anymore. So I like these. This is a young architect named Jimenez Lai. He draws these manga cartoons that basically are always about the future. Have wonderful commentary about architecture. Says, you know, the guy in the future was this he's saying, was this architecture or that? So he's sort of looking like, these are all the, you know, CCTV. You can see these are the current architecture of the day. This is what most of the stuff was, and in the future he's trying to figure it out. So I invented this character. It's called Dog Vader. And then I decided to do, I got interested in this problem of multiple and ontologies, and I decided that cartoons, that I don't like collage, or was famously against collage. But when you look at a cartoon is not a collage. A cartoon is a different ontology. So even if you put a cartoon on top of reality, like a David Sally painting, they don't work like collage. They work in an entirely different way. There are multiple ontologies that work at the same time. So then I decided we would do these studio. I just said, here's what I'm doing in studio now. I had a bad student. I had a student who wasn't doing very well. So he said, well, what should I do? And I said, go to Michael Moss's website and just copy one of their projects. So he went to the website. He found this project. It was made with a physics generator. This is truly throwing a bunch of boxes on the table as architecture. Completely comic. Not funny, but completely comic. And I said, just copy it, change the color. It's beautiful. I told you. And then, yeah, there's... To get into this house, you go up the seesaw, the fat guy jumps on it, you land on there. There it is. That's the entry to the house. I don't know if you can. Some of us can read the historical sources in all of these houses. I try to make sure that they're not part of any publication, but you may see Hayduk's House 2 here, or By House, I'm sorry. There's the... Oh, this was for A.O. Weissman. I thought I really behaved badly that time. I apologize to you. I actually really... I maintain my conviction of my utter frustration and ambivalence about his presentation, but I shouldn't have behaved like I behaved. So I thought it was my responsibility to say I was sorry to you for behaving that way, to get a shirt from Israel. I don't know, Ohio State. This says Ohio State University, and I can't quite tell if it says Jeff or Jew. One or the other. And then I thought, I have to go get a forensic work of architecture and show that it has architecture. Thing I asked, how can we use this? So I came upon this building, which I think is really beautiful. It was in Scientific American. And the more I thought, wow, who did this? And it turns out this is how it was built. It was this. It had a piece of failure and became that. So I understood that, I shouldn't, for me it wasn't, I should ignore this. This is not proper history. This is just a new technique for producing exactly, but it's self-calculating form, it's emergent form, it's everything we teach now in the DRL. I just love history. Thank you. It's utterly, it has no presence, it has no weight. It's a piece of graphics. There's no, pardon me?
Is that enough to be a liberation?
No, maybe not. I mean, do you know Eric Satie's work? Basically, in the time when the debate was between Wagnerians and Brahmsians in early 20th century music, he basically wrote pages and pages and pages of very simple melodies. And the question, is that enough, was asked. And it set into motion what we consider to be, he's one of the great fathers, Villesavoie as important, serious, worthwhile of its reputation. It also produces Villa de Lava, I think. It gives some weight to that. Whether it's enough is a question that we're going to only answer when copies of it produce it as an original. So it's, for me, right now, worth asking about. It was also unbelievably cheap. You don't like it, I take it. See, here's my question for you. I trust that, and I know that's correct. Remember not liking asparagus? You don't remember when you were a kid not liking asparagus? I guarantee you didn't. It's just, the issue is not liking it is an important effect, but then you have to ask yourself, to what extent do I want to be governed by that, or should I explore that for its potential effect-making? In other words, once you don't like something, the work that I think you should be deeply suspicious of is the work that you're utterly indifferent to, could care less about. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And so I like that work precisely for that effect, but I also like it. I didn't like it when I first saw it, but the more I study it, the more I think about it, the more the references don't explain it. It is not an act of stare decisis. Neither is it an act of, it's more an act of discussion between one building and another, but it's more, for me, it's about the copy producing the original as the original. And in so doing, setting into motion a farce, or setting into motion what I prefer to think of as comedy. And you have to ask yourself why architecture doesn't have a really strong discourse of the comedy. It has a great discourse of the tragic. Every other discipline, film, literature, you read Pynchon, it's tragedy. You read David Foster Wallace, it's comedy. Infinite Jest ranks with Pynchon. Any other questions? I'll stand up here.
Along the lines of what you're just talking about, Hayden White's meta-history?
Yes.
Where there was when that was written, it was received as a kind of relativism. In other words, the tragedy, comedy, irony, the different modes of history writing were seen to relativize. And there was a debate with Carlo Ginzburg about the limit cases around this, in this case, the Holocaust. So the question, in some sense, was, what would it mean to write the history of the Holocaust in one of these other non-tragic modes?
Right.
So I don't want to go entirely, sort of speculate on that, but actually to the Will Alsop thing, because I don't know if this would be within the sphere that you were imagining, but what was in my mind when you were asking that question about its citations was suprematism. I assume that here via...
Yeah, Melnikov.
But his thing with Rem is probably related to this too. There's Libeskind and so on in the back. Okay, so it becomes interesting, I think, when and this is really the question, is in a sense what happens when you have two potentially contradictory possibilities in producing an origin, right, or a point of departure. So on the one hand, Villesavoie, and the other, maybe to strengthen it a little bit, Lissitzky rather than...
Yeah, this is actually who I met.
Yeah, but no, rather than Malevich, but and that would account for the red bar in a different way. Okay, because in a sense it reposes the question, at least to me, architecture or revolution, not automatically because Lissitzky's on the side of revolution and Corb's on the side of architecture, but in the form of a kind of and/or, ambiguity. So it's at least I feel compelled to address that problem, to say, okay, what would be the difference?
Exactly, yes.
In reading this in Corbusian terms versus constructivist terms around that question, which is essentially the relationship, the art-society question.
So thank God you had the good sense not to become a pop art critic and go do hard history, because you're good at it. I mean, I think you're exactly right. I actually think you're exactly right. But it can't pose any questions at all if you have no relationship to it historically. But there's not one historical relationship. For example, I think Johnson's mistaken when he says we cannot not know history. is we cannot not know a history, but we are invited always to refabricate our own histories. In fact, you're responsible to do that. When Peter was studying at Cambridge and also at Cornell, all they were taught was Gothic architecture, and that essentially Renaissance architecture was unworthy of study, but Gothic architecture was the achievement of the tectonic in a sense. Since Peter wanted to formulate the linguistic model, Gothic did him no good whatsoever, and he needed Alberti and to essentially retrospectively write a history of semiotics in architecture. And so I guess one of the things that bothers me a little bit is the notion of it's not the notion of a canonic history, but a notion of truth-telling in history, as opposed to option making. You know.
Well, probably that's the difference. I mean, my concern, if I were to sort of enunciate a concern with like the present, it's with pluralism, essentially, and what you just described, sort of confirms that. But let's say you have these two, let's make them mutually exclusive, or at least antagonistic options, interpretive options.
Okay.
And in one sense, this could be said, like that building travesties the 20th century in that sense, by making farcical what was, in sense, historical in the sense, the possible transformation of society that constructivism wanted to participate in, and so on and so forth, when, by in a sense, mocking that, and effectively, I agree with you, that it does work, then what does that say about the possibility of, in effect, recuperating that type of project, transformative project?
Well, I guess my question to you would be, for us, it has exactly the powers that you, but should it be constructed as an original by future and work like the work I showed, then it will not be that. It will be the tragedy, which will then later, my problem is the history's desire for stare decisis. Essentially, even if it's a mockery which protects the status of the original as the original.
No, I agree with that.
Because, for example, Ken Frampton's essay on Villa Stein was about the degree to which it mocked Palladio, and that it was essentially a mockery of Palladio. So, who cares, right? But you have to understand something. This has to do with the question of, just my fascination with the question of what an architect decides to do in the problem of new building and how we teach toward that. So it's not a,
I don't want to monopolize.
He gets no questions. He was on this jury in Hernan Alonso studio in Vienna, and it was a good day. And he ended it in saying, if we follow you, the discipline will die, and the world will, suffer the greatest possible leprosy. It was and I was so glad he wasn't going to be here today.
I think I seem to hear you say that the only model of precedent that is of any interest is a precedent of effect. But it seems to me that one might criticize this by saying that your sequence of precedenting effects are always images, and that if one supposes that eventually the building ceases to be an image once it gets built, its effects might be, there are considerable other effects than those that it exercise.
You mean on the people that use the building?
Well, let's say the Andorra building, if it was actually built, would have a number of other effects other than those in the image. So one might say, well, there's a criticism here that you're putting forward a purely iconographical approach to architecture.
Well, maybe the examples show that. My answer to this is never popular. I could care less about the lives of people in buildings, because basically, it's going to be okay. They're going to be dry. There's going to be light. Sometimes they might be more comfortable or less comfortable, but there's a huge body of knowledge about effectively producing buildings for the lives of people in architecture, and a huge practice for it. For me, architecture is about a small group of people called its audience, and the degree, just like dance is, just like theater is. You know, there's a bohemian demimonde of people that exaggerate the potential architectural effects, and in that exaggeration mobilize them as new possible ontologies. Now, you do a slide lecture for 45 minutes or so, and you basically try to pick the examples that are the most intensely powerful. So you do. It is lapse into graphics, but I don't believe it's always that. I believe that, for example, the example of the effect of the Seattle Library versus Breuer is deeply dependent on the experience of the buildings and the way they construct the institutional characters, and there's nothing graphic about that. I didn't need a slide, you know. So I think when you walk into the Seattle Library and you walk into the Breuer building, there's nothing graphic about those effects, and I'm as interested in those effects. I'm also interested in the effect of new authenticity. For example, the dust in Bangkok that's a really interesting détournement of local materiality, détournement through surrealism to produce a kind of positive but non-graphic affective relationship to the context. You know, so graphic stuff always has the most appeal. It also, but I don't think I'm subject as much to that criticism in my writing and work as a lecturer would present, but maybe. Any other questions? Okay. Wait. In the back, a favorable question, but for a person I've never met. I can repeat it. Oh, here's one. Here's one. Sorry. Are y'all going to walk around and look at how funny Bedford Square is after? You really get a kick at it.
The question I have is really, I think maybe I didn't understand some parts of the lecture, specifically in regards to pedagogy. So in what you're saying, if the realm of discourse of architecture is between peers, so if you look at like Lichtenstein, what you're saying with that, and his discussion is between himself, Warhol, and now you look at contemporary architecture and we're dealing with techniques and sort of how they manifest themselves through affects. If historical relevant, if it's not necessary that things are historically relevant, if you couldn't look at the built environment around you, you can look at polemic works or works that are just by non-famous architects. You can, maybe Alsop looked at the National Gallery for his inspiration. So in that context, if the discussion is really between peers, between sort of pop culture, between sort of built environment, is it necessary to have a pedagogical instructor?
Yes. Particularly highly paid pedagogical instructors are absolutely necessary to liberate you from the onerous weight of mediocre instruction. No, I think, you know, I told you what I thought an instructor does. An instructor is, you know, I look at Villa Savoye, I look at the 5 points of Villa Savoye. It's easy for me to teach its democratic ambitions. So the 5 points add up to a simple disestablishment of the feudal legacy of land as datum. Each of the 5 points contributes to deterritorializing the feudal legacy of land. The ground is land. To say the ground is land is to treat what was physical or phenomenological as political. Ground is not land is not the thing you stand on. Land is the policy that's saturated. And when Korb wrote Architectural Revolution, he was talking about that problem, essentially about disestablishing ground from land and reestablishing it as datum. Datum, and therefore the floor plates and the rooftop garden and the ribbon window and the pilotis all add up to that act. Now, they don't add. The problem with Korb is he imagined that would have a kind of generalizable effect. It doesn't. People may like the building or not like the effect, but there's a very small audience for whom that is a powerful and persistent effect. And if I can awaken that, and it's possible features in the small audience that's sensitive to that, then I will have done my job. But without that, so you basically have to be told the definitive stories, or the stories that decide for you how to decide about the building, so that you either submit to that or resist it. And I believe that's our job.
I mean, can I of add to that, that I think what the question kind of raises, and it's, I mean, I think it's an acute problem at the AA, is if you think of the problem of a teacher, the question really at the AA is, should that teacher be giving a teaching, or should they be teaching? What is the difference, in a sense, between saying students are invited to come, as they are in some sense, to a unit, a design unit, on the ground that you would like to kind of gain something from a teaching by somebody, but it would apply also to kind of non-design work, or, as it were, is the kind of institution going to set kind of norms in terms of things like expectations, syllabuses, etc., which are to be delivered by teaching. You know, in that sense, there's a very distinct tension between a teaching and teaching. I think at the moment the problem is that the institutional side of that is gaining the upper hand. Not least, as it were, because anyone from REBA or the institution itself says increasingly the problem is that students come here without that knowledge, without which they could not actually expose themselves to a teaching. It's as if suddenly Plato kind of says, well, actually, Socrates, before you start talking, could you give us a few weeks on the pre-Socratics? No thanks, I don't do that. But I think, you know, it touches on a real problem, which in a sense ought to be an issue now. Patrick.
Thanks. I think that's a very interesting point, and my comment is that this kind of tension you're talking about is a fundamental contradiction, and the duplicity of purpose and alignment of an institution like the AA. I think in terms of the notion of pedagogy belongs to the kind of function system of the education system in society, which is quite distinct from architecture as a domain and the sciences as a domain. Mm-hmm. And a textbook is in fact not contributing to science, it's something else, it's quite different. And as you move from the, let's say in primary school and middle school and secondary school and high school, you in the domain of pedagogy, and you deliver not a teaching. You cannot allow yourself to be engaged in a teaching specifically, because that would contradict that role of pedagogy as a kind of bringing up the potential, Bildung, of at the same time being a part of selection mechanism and for society. But at the AA, and let's say it might also be something between, and in fact the totality of the AA is renunciating teaching in the sense. It's just has to fake it for institutional reasons. And
are you getting this? I want Brett to hear this.
and we are engaged, and it's my self-consciousness. I'm only interested in promoting a teaching and finding collaborators in a research project and in its architecture.
Right.
It's not pedagogy. I'm enunciating pedagogy. I'm just instrumentalizing institution, and that's what the whole of the A works like this with the unit system. They even utilize first-year students as career building and collective projects. And I think, but that's because we don't have a kind of another separated out research vehicle. So the educational institutions become this kind of extension of the discipline. And I want to find that it's a very important and interesting tension, and therefore the notion of pedagogy is problematic. And I find it interesting also with Jeff and understanding him, because he's not just a pedagogue, he's also a kind of active promoter and instigator and developer of the discipline as its kind of most advanced and innovative trajectory. And that is different from, I think, the task of teaching. And so that's one interesting discourse. I want to come back on another point for what Jeff was talking about. This kind of sense that you have the kind of one might call it the expert discourse, the internal discourse of the disciplines where the peers talk to each other. And I think, again, for me now, this is not teaching, this is kind of collaboratively researching. And I think in your way of talking about these issues, this kind of demimonde of connoisseurs, of experts, and that this is, let's say, compromised and let's say not comprehensive. When you talked about, for instance, that building of also being liberating, you can show it there. At first we might have thought is a kind of liberating act for that place, for the institutions, for that piece of urban life, and then it reveals that what you mean it's liberating for kind of that demimonde discourse and the development of the discipline.
I think it's how it happened.
And I think what is interesting to me is that at a certain point, although I do believe that there's a certain division of labor in that internal expert discourse, one is more self-referential, more concerned with the elaboration of repertoires and formal possibilities, the kind of effects you're talking about,
Right.
the kind of techniques and the expert knowledge of producing effects and techniques is one part of that expert discourse. There's another part where I think that Reinhold comes in. He wouldn't be satisfied with this, and I wouldn't be satisfied with this either, that you have part of that expert discourse precisely understand how this matters and manifests itself in the world beyond the discourse, what the effect and potential liberation impact of this building is on site in its locale and institutional efficacy. And this must also be part of that expert discourse. I understand there is this kind of expert discourse, and it has this element of talking about techniques, effects, and the eye and the training of the eye, which you rightly promote. But I think there's this other responsibility of the expert discourse, and often this is not kind of coincident in one discourse, but separate discourse, where we have to speculate and ask ourselves: is that building liberating on site for what it is worth?
Yes.
And the historical references play into both.
Yes. I mean,
Discourses.
you're absolutely right. Let's say that would be Nikolai's job, I think, more than my job. My job is an internal, I'm a member of the internal discourse and a member of the Bohemian Demimonde. The question about the Bohemian Demimonde is really simple. By the time you've made a horror movie, it's not going to be scary to you at all. So you have to be working as an expert in the expert practice of guessing what an effect will be long past the fact that you can have any empathetic relationship to its potential audiences. And so you cannot use empathetic relationships to potentially remote audiences in any way as a teaching tool, either in the atelier model or in the university model. And so I think that's why it always sounds like it all means it's all about one discourse. It's not all about one discourse. It's about, in the end, you basically, in order to be a surgeon, you just have to understand you're not cutting on a body anymore. I mean, you will be in the mood of an expert practitioner regardless of your ambitions to touch and the directions to which you're going to be touching a potential remote audience. And so, I mean, at Ohio State and at Princeton, I thought the atelier model, which is the one I came here first, became too hermetic. Although I still think it's the best model. It's got the best pedagogical history in architecture, although architecture is not a discipline that has a strong pedagogical history. The university model is utterly corrupt, exactly for the reasons that Reinhold was talking about. You spend 10 weeks in one thing, you spend 10 weeks in another way. All you come out is just basically indifference. No passion. For me, the creative writing, the Arizona State creative writing thing is essentially an atelier model with constant demands for coming out of your atelier and discussing the work, and therefore it creates a population, or an atelier population, and a meta population. I don't know how you do it here because of the size and stuff, but those are my interests. Look, here's also, it's just stories, and I'm going to end on this. I love the fact that Corbin Perret fought it out in the newspaper in Paris about whether a window was horizontal or vertical. I mean, I thought the fact that two great friends ended up hating each other and belittling each other in the front of the public record, I love that. I love that when Theo van Doesburg showed his first rhomboid rotation of a neoplastic painting, Mondrian hit him in the head with an iron, and send him to the hospital. He was so incensed, So I guarantee you I could not recuperate that for myself, even with a deep understanding of that work. So as a member even of a dedicated audience to that, it will never make me so mad that but unless it makes you that, and why I say, one of the fields I'm most worried about now is contemporary music production. It has become so democratized and so atomized that it basically is unable to, it automatically produces new genres. It is a genre-producing automaton. So every week there's more and more and more. And so instead of politicizing the discussion and impassioning the discussion, it's becoming infinitely even personal, if not democratic. Fortunately, we're not there yet. So.
Okay, well, I think we're going to have to stop in a moment. Jeff raises the problem at the end of the lack of passion. One might even say kind of violence. That is indeed, I think, a pedagogical problem, since now violence to students is almost completely kind of forbidden. We were discussing yesterday. Well, I think yes, no, please don't do it. I suspect there are still trainings. I dare say one does not become a ballet star without some violence having been done you, and I think it's probably still true in music, but it's interesting to speculate. Indeed, one of the problems, in trying to get students to do something, is that one no longer has any kind of sanctions that one might kind of impose, like, do this or else. Or else what? You won't know about it. Good. So perhaps we might turn to some of those questions this afternoon. I'd like to...
Kick them out.
What?
Whenever I teach a studio, my first thing is to pick somebody and kick them out. And all the other ones.
Well, I have to say you left the AA before the students became very aware of their rights. And it was probably a good moment to go. Everyone remarks now that actually students have a rather vivid sense of their rights, not as so much as citizens of the AA, but actually of consumers. Sorry?